Welcome guys, in this video we'll talk about the last kind of data binding, which is two-way data binding. We'll see what is two-way data binding, how to implement it, and when you should go for the two-way data binding. Let's get started. This is part of the video series Angular course. If you have not watched the earlier videos, you can go through them for a better understanding. Let's say we have a variable inside our component. Now this variable which is highlighted is also known as property of our class. Why it is called property? Because this is a special kind of variable and is declared on a class level. It's not declared inside a method. So this is a property. Now in two-way data binding specifically, this property should be a data bound property. What is a data bound property? The property that you use inside a template to bind the data with your component, like you have been already doing with text interpolation and property binding. But the difference of two-way data binding from the property binding or text interpolation is two-way binding lets your data travel both ways. So your template can also send data to the component and component can also send data to the template. So it's two-way. The purpose of this kind of data binding is to keep your variable in sync between the component and the template. If a change is made on that property within the component, that change will immediately reflect to the template, and if the user makes changes in the template, then that change will also reflect in the component. Let's see how it is actually implemented and how you can use two-way data binding in your code. I have defined an input element, and just below the input element I am displaying the value of a property, and this property is defined in my TypeScript value, and the initial value is set to be quarterly. Now my aim is to bind this value with the input tag, so we can easily do that by using the value property and using the property binding. So what you have to do, we have to just use this message. So when we look back to the website, initially the value looks fine. So our text is also representing the property value and our input is also filled up with the initial value. But if I now start making change within this input box, then the change is not reflecting just below the text box. That is what we want to achieve using the two-way binding. Instead of using the property binding, we will use the two-way binding. To do so, we have to use a directive provided by Angular, which is ngModel. We have to enclose this ngModel within parenthesis and then this entire thing within a bracket. Now when I try to save this, it gives me an error. Let's see what is the error. It says can't bind to ngModel since it's not a known property of input. That means Angular cannot recognize this particular keyword here. This directive is a part of a separate module, which is forms module. We have to import the forms module before using the ngModel. To import that, we will go back to our app module and put the forms module within the imports array. When I save this, the error is now gone. Why these two kinds of enclosures are used? Because this is a combination of event binding and property binding if you look closely. Because in two-way data binding, the data goes in both ways between the template and the component. That's why it has this special syntax. Let's now see it in action. Our input field is pre-populated with the value quarterly, and now let me start making change on this input field. You can see as soon as I type in something within the input field, the value gets reflected within the paragraph tag just below the input field. Let's try to understand what just happened. How does that happen? Now when our page loads for the first time, this value here is brought from our message property, which is defined in the TypeScript file. So our TypeScript file has a property message and is initialized to quarterly. Since we are using two-way binding, the value of this property populates our input field using the same behavior as property binding. So for the first time, the data came from the component to the template. Now as soon as we start making change on this input field, our ngModel directive starts propagating that change into our property message. So in this case, data goes from template to our TypeScript file and also changes this property. This way our data bound property message always be in sync between the template and the component. And since we are using string interpolation here to display the current value of the message, that message is also reflected under the paragraph tag. That is how it works. We told that this ngModel is a combination of property binding and event binding. It would be great if we can actually separate this property binding and event binding from the two-way binding. To do that, I would get rid of the two-way binding syntax and make it a property binding. So in this case, this syntax is of property binding and will work also as property binding. Let's see what I mean by that. In this case, the input field will be populated with the message from the TypeScript file, because property binding brings data from the TypeScript file to the template, so it is populated with Kodalik. But if I start making change, that change won't be reflected in the paragraph tag, since this change is not propagated back to the TypeScript file. To send the data from the template file to the TypeScript file, we know what we need to do. We need to use event binding. Our ngModel directive has a particular event which is known as ngModelChange, and this event should be enclosed within parentheses as per the event binding syntax, and this will be fired whenever our model undergoes change. I would like to call a function on model change when this event occurs. Now, to get the data associated with an event, what do we need to do? Yes, we need to define that special variable $event, and then within the function we have to catch that event data. Now let me console log our event data. First, let me open the console so that we can see the console messages. Now also our input field is pre-populated with the value as per the property binding behavior, and when I start making change, you can see our console log is reflecting the latest value. So as soon as I hit a key, our model changes, and this event here, ngModelChange, is getting invoked, and that is sending us the latest data which is input into the field, and we are logging that message here. This is the broken down version of two-way binding, and hence it is called a combination of property binding and event binding. One word of caution regarding the usage of two-way binding. If your input field, or where you are using your two-way binding, is enclosed within a form, which is normal to have in your practical application, then you might come across this kind of error. You can see our two-way binding is no longer working, and it is throwing us an error in the console. It says if ngModel is used within a form tag, either the name attribute must be present, blah blah blah. So what it is basically asking us is to have a name attribute in our input element. Not so difficult to do. Let me have a name attribute. We can have any value under the name attribute, let's say message, and good, the error is gone. Don't get confused, this name attribute has nothing to do with our message property. I can name it anything, let's say message name will also work. That basically does not matter, but you must have a name attribute, because to access the value of a form, we generally use a JavaScript object which should have a key value pair. Now value is understood that whatever value your ngModel holds will be the value, but what will be the key? Your name attribute here works as a key. That's why name attribute is a must if you use it within a form. As of now, this is all you need to know about two-way data binding, but I will still like to mention that this kind of data binding is also possible to be implemented in custom components. The example that you saw is for standard input element of a form. But if it's not a standard input and it's a custom component that you have created, you can also implement two-way data binding for that, and that we'll cover in our components module. That's it for now. If you have any question, drop them in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe my channel.